You know, when you think about the U.S. Bill of Rights, you've got the big ones, right? Freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, but there's one that's almost always overlooked. The Third Amendment. Yeah, the one about not having to let soldiers crash at your place. It sounds like a total relic from the 1700s, but believe me, its story is far from over.
I love this quote from legal scholar Glenn Harlan Reynolds. He said the Third Amendment is basically the Rodney Dangerfield of the Bill of Rights. It gets no respect. And he's right. For most of American history, it's been a constitutional ghost, rarely brought up in court and never, ever the main reason for a Supreme Court decision.
So how did this forgotten amendment suddenly get its day in court? Well, it all goes back to a story that on the surface has nothing to do with it. A really intense prison guard strike in New York in 1979 ended up sparking the single most important court case in the amendment's entire history. And that case turned it from a historical footnote into a powerful defense of our right to privacy at home.
Okay, so before we dive into the whole prison strike drama, we need to take a quick step back. To really get why this case was so huge, you have to understand why the founders cared so deeply about this issue in the first place. For them, this was anything but a forgotten right.
This was a grievance with really deep roots. For more than a century, American colonists had been fighting against being forced to house and feed soldiers. The British Quartering Acts in the 1760s were a massive point of contention. They saw it as a deeply oppressive intrusion into their homes, into their private lives. It was such a big deal that they even listed it in the Declaration of Independence as a reason to break away from England. So when it was time to write the Bill of Rights, adding this protection was a total no-brainer.
All right, now let's fast forward, way forward. We're talking nearly 200 years to 1979. The setting isn't some colonial village, but a New York State prison where a labor dispute is about to explode and, believe it or not, give the Third Amendment its big moment.
So picture this, it's April 1979. Negotiations between the state and the Corrections Officers Union have totally broken down. So almost all of New York's 7,000 corrections officers walk off the job, all at once. This creates an immediate, massive crisis. The state's prisons are basically unmanned.
And this is where the perfect storm for a Third Amendment challenge comes together. Meet our key players, two officers, Mary Ann Engblom and Charles Palmer. They actually lived in apartments right there on the prison grounds, paying rent to the state. When the strike hit, the governor called in the National Guard to take over. And then state officials kicked the striking officers out of their homes and moved the National Guardsmen in. They literally quartered soldiers in their place.
So, what did Engblom and Palmer do? They sued. In their case, Engblom v. Carey worked its way all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. The court suddenly had to answer some fundamental questions about the Third Amendment that nobody had ever bothered to answer before.
And this wasn't just any court either. The Second Circuit is one of the most influential federal courts in the entire country. So whatever it decided was going to set a massive precedent for what this forgotten amendment actually means in our modern world.
The court's ruling was frankly revolutionary. It laid down three huge principles that redefined the amendment. First, it said that yes, National Guardsmen count as soldiers. Second, and this is a really big deal, it ruled that the Third Amendment applies to state and local governments, not just the feds. That's a process called incorporation. And third, it totally expanded the idea of who an owner is. It's not just the person who holds the deed. The protection extends to anyone with a legal right to kick people out of their home, and that includes renters, like Engblom and Palmer.
So they won. Case closed, right? Well, not so fast. Here's the twist. While they won the constitutional argument, they never actually received any money in damages. The court said the state officials were protected by something called qualified immunity. Basically, because the law hadn't been clearly established back then, the officials couldn't have known they were violating the Third Amendment. Why? Because no court had ever interpreted it that way before.
But even without a big payout, the case accomplished something much, much bigger. It cemented the idea that the Third Amendment isn't just about soldiers sleeping on your couch. It's really about a fundamental right to privacy in your own home.
This all ties into this fascinating, kind of nerdy legal concept called the constitutional penumbra. The idea is that the rights written down in the Constitution cast shadows or penumbras around them. And these shadows create other implied rights, like a right to privacy, that aren't explicitly spelled out but are still protected.
And this wasn't some new idea either. The Supreme Court had actually pointed to this years earlier in the huge privacy case Griswold versus Connecticut. Justice William O. Douglas specifically called out the Third Amendment as one of the key pillars that helps create this zone of privacy.
And this really gets to the core of it all. The real problem with quartering isn't just the inconvenience. It's the government literally inserting itself into the fabric of your private life, disrupting your family, and watching your every move. It's a much deeper violation than just a simple search. It's an intrusion into your private world. So you might be thinking, okay, that's a cool history lesson, but why does any of this matter today? We don't exactly have redcoats knocking on our doors. That's a fair question. But the principles from this case raise some really provocative questions for our world right now. For instance, think about this. We see police departments using military-grade equipment, military-style tactics. At what point does the line between a police officer and a soldier start to get blurry? The Engblom case said National Guardsmen are soldiers. So where do we draw that line for other government agents?
And what about our technology? Let's take it a step further. What if the government required you to install surveillance software on your laptop, or put a smart device in your home that monitored all your activity? Would that count as a digital insertion of state agents into the fabric of your private life? Could that be a new kind of quartering?
Ultimately, it all comes down to this really simple but powerful idea. As one expert so perfectly put it, the Third Amendment is all about keeping the grubby boots of officialdom out of the domestic realm. It's about making sure your home is a sanctuary, a space free from government intrusion.
And that leaves us with one last, massive question to think about. We live in a world where our homes are filled with smart speakers that are always listening, cameras that are always watching. The line between our private space and the outside world has never been more blurred. So in this age of constant connection, what does it truly mean to keep the government out of your house? It seems the amendment that time forgot might be more important now than ever before.